So this morning I'm going to try to replace the right front CV axle on this 2016 Porsche Macan S. It was in the dealership for repair that I didn't have time to do, and they noticed that the boot was split on it and that the lubricant was coming out. So I went online trying to find videos regarding replacing the CV axle, which I've done a lot on Porsche 944s and 914s and even a 928. They're all kind of similar on those older cars. I was a little bit leery of the Macan being an all-wheel drive vehicle, if there was something different going on there with the CV axle. And frankly, my first thought was, if it's a boot, I'll take the axle apart and replace the boots. It's a little bit involved. It takes some time, and it's messy because you got to repack the axle joint itself. But yeah, when I looked, I could not find any pertinent videos to that repair. I found a couple for Cayenne. I'm hopeful that the Cayenne CV axle is similar to the Macan. You would think so. But I went ahead and ordered a complete axle for time's sake, and that way I can get the car back on the road. This is my wife's daily driver. And we'll see how this goes, and hopefully this video will be helpful for somebody, because these Macans, these first generation Macans are hitting, this one has I think 135,000 on it. So CV axles are generally considered a wear item, and hopefully I can get through this process within 3 or 4 hours. Let's see how it goes. So here's the replacement CV axle, and you'll notice first it's got a splined end that mates up with the hub, a little cap, and then there's an orifice, a threaded orifice. So I do not believe there's a castle nut, unlike the Cayenne, which in the videos I saw had a castle nut. So there's some type of, I think it's like a shoulder screw, probably a big Torx. Here's the part number. Hopefully that's the correct part number. It is a Porsche part. It's not rebuilt. And then this end mates up with the transmission, transaxle, whatever it is on a front wheel drive vehicle. So there's a part. And if it's not the right one, I'll have to pack it up and send it back for the correct one. Let's see how it goes. Okay, so got the car supported slightly with the lift just to get weight. It's typically how I break the castle nut, but as you can see, this is no castle nut. This is like a big honking hex. Biggest one I have is 17 millimeter. This is bigger than that. So I'm going to find out exactly what size it is, and I'll have to source. It's probably going to be a 19 or a 20 millimeter hex. And it's probably torqued down pretty darn good. So it's got to fit perfectly to break that torque. Oh boy. So it turned out to be a 19 millimeter. I've got it loose with a breaker bar and a pipe. I mean, I've done castle nuts that were a lot tighter. It took a lot longer pipe. So this one's probably around 200 foot-pounds. But now that I've got that loose, I can take off the wheel and probably use the bolt itself, back it off a ways, and then use some kind of hammer to break the splines loose on the axle. So if you look in there, you can see the splines. And then here's the big bolt that came out. So basically I'm going to thread this back in pretty good ways. And then use a pretty sizable mallet or something to push that CV axle back towards the transaxle. And then we're going to have to take some of this suspension apart to fish that axle out of there. It's got like a heat shield around that. The bracket for the hoses and everything appears to be one common bracket. Has all that stuff. So I'm using a ratcheting 10mm to take that loose. And that way I can swing all that stuff out of the way. I'm still looking at the CV axle. I mean, I'm just turning the hub by hand. And I'm starting to get hopeful that I can push it on through without taking the suspension apart. That remains to be seen. So to get the suspension to swing out of the way, I think I'm going to go up top here and get those out like a wishbone up top, control arms, whatever. Looks like there's just one common bolt that holds those. I'm hopeful they will pop out and not monkey up those ball joints on those arms. So here we go. It's a long 17mm shoulder bolt that goes through that knuckle that captures those two ball joints on those top control arms. I guess that's what they're called. I went ahead and used a brass punch to push them out. You could use a pickle fork, but you'd tear those little boots all to hell and have to replace that control arm most likely. So I just was cautious. Now putting them back in there may be difficult because you're really not supposed to beat on the top sides of them. But I've put wedges in here to open that, but I'm a little bit concerned about that because it's a alloy, and you know, you wedge it too much and you break it, and I bet you that's a really expensive part. But anyway, this has gotten that pretty loose. So let me kind of keep playing around here and see if I have enough play to get that axle out. So that appears to have given enough room. The splines popped out of the hub. So now I'm going to get down in there inside around that heat shield and get those Torx bolts out that hold the axle to the transmission, transaxle, whatever you want to call it. And I should be able to fish that thing out of there at this point. That would be super nice, not having to take the whole suspension apart. I noted on the Cayennes, this strut mount that goes down, I mean, I didn't look at it in great detail, but it was like a fork. It had another piece, and they were actually having to pull the axle out in between there. So they really were having to drop quite a bit of the front suspension to get that axle out. So maybe Porsche learned a lesson and decided that only having one member there was enough strength. Who knows? So what I thought was going to be trouble is, in fact, that those bolts holding the flange to the transaxle, they're actually 10mm triple square, I call them. So I could not get an impact in there because of the geometry, and and they're pretty tight. So what I had to do to get leverage and keep the axle from spinning, because no matter if you got parking brake on or if you got the vehicle in drive or whatever, it will spin as you're trying to break the bolt loose. What I had to do was spline the CV axle back into the hub, put this bar on it, dangling on a couple of lugs, and that gave me like leverage to use the breaker bar. I mean, the one thing you don't want to do is strip out those bolts down in there, because if you do, you are in a world of trouble. Believe me, I don't know how you would extract them, but it would not be fun. So that's what I'm doing right now. I'm getting those out, and then hopefully we won't encounter any more problems. Okay, the axle is out. Didn't strip any triple square bolts. There's the flange plate. There's plenty of room around the heat shield, so that's all good stuff. It's just the troublesome nature of getting those triple square bolts out. So let's go look at the offending part. I noted a different part number than what was sent. However, they appear to be identical to one another in the bolt spacing and splines and all that. So hopefully one has just superseded the other. I did contemplate putting boots on this one with the bad boot. However, I did not know what I would encounter when I got into that. I've done them on 944s and 914s, and I believe I did one on a 928, and there's basically a circlip that holds the bearing cage on. On this one, I actually found a video of some guys taking apart one off a Cayenne, and the circlip is embedded. In other words, at this end, and probably on this end as well, there's a splined, this is just a shaft with splines on either end, and it doesn't protrude through with a circlip on the outside, because inside of here is the bearings and the cage. It actually goes into the bearing cage, and then there's an internal circlip. Some of you guys may have dealt with this before, and you basically strip the old boot off and they were using a chisel to pop it off that internal circlip. And, I don't know, it looked pretty rough on the cage, but anyway, now that I have a spare axle, I can get some boots and try to rebuild it. The boots are relatively inexpensive. Both boots, I think, like $50. So that way, and I think left and right are identical to one another. Let's go take a look at that. See if they look the same. I could even maybe spot a part number here. So that's a 995 B407 271A. Yep. So left and right are interchangeable. Okay, well, let me get started putting this good axle in. I have the axle to flange bolt started, just a little loose, and now I'm introducing the splines into the hub. Now, one thing I found is you're like wrestling that loose suspension and trying to line that up. So I put a ratchet strap up top and a floor jack underneath just to get it all stabilized. And then I'm going to do the same thing when I go to tighten. I'm going to put my bar on those two lug nuts and I'm going to torque it, the flange bolts to 40 foot-pounds. So, little tip. Flange bolts all torqued down. That was uneventful. So the axle, like I said, I splined it up to do the tightening. You can see how much is left. I kind of like this this bolt because I'm sure they did this for manufacturing purposes. Unlike a castle bolt where you really got to have your stub axle protruding, now as long as you can get a bite with your threads, that will actually pull the splined axle into the hub, which should work out great. The torque specs I found, like I said, it was 41 foot-pounds on the flange bolts, 350, which is standard on those castle nuts. That's what it's saying for this bad boy. So I don't have an impact wrench that goes up that high. I'm going to put my bar on it and my cheater bar and put exactly the same amount of pressure it took to take it off. I don't think it was no 350 foot-pounds, but that's just me. So to get these two upper control arms, I guess they're called, pulled into them, I used a clamp and just kind of worked them in there slowly, lined them up. Yes, eventually I did have to do some tapping on them, but not a whole lot. I mean, it wasn't as bad as I expected it to be. I did note the bushings are starting to show some wear, some cracking, so that'll have to be addressed at some point. And we got the bracket back on. So that's the last thing before mounting the wheel. I put the wheel on and that way I can set her down and torque down that axle nut. Okay, all buttoned up, ready for a test drive. Saved a lot of money doing that myself. The dealer quoted me over $2,500 to change that CV axle. I sourced the part itself at another Porsche dealership in Atlanta, which was like $650 for the axle. That's pretty pricey, but and I had to buy the 19 millimeter hex. I didn't have that, so that was Harbor Freight. That was another 30 bucks. So 700, call it 700 bucks versus 2,500. 3-4 hours. You know, most troublesome part would probably be those axle bolts inside of that heat shield. It's a little tough to get to. Be careful, don't strip them out. Otherwise, you can do it. It really helps that I have a lift here. You could do it on jack stands. Be careful. Thanks for watching and see you on the next one.